Now let me say first of all that the most important thing to consider about a dominant chord is where it's going. If the chord progression is G dominant 7th resolving to C major, and the rhythm section plays an altered dominant chord, but the soloist doesn't incorporate those alterations in the scale, the world will not end. Now, the world is not going to end regardless of what a jazz soloist plays, although some jazz haters might wish it would. But the point is that as long as everyone winds up on the C major chord, all's well that ends well. Now second, when I talk about scales, I want to reiterate that I think of them as pools of notes to choose from relating to specific chords. They're not the only notes you can play. You can make any note work on any chord. But they're the notes from which the harmony of the chord is derived. Being precise in your choice of scale will make the harmony clear in your lines, and for most people who are learning to improvise, that's a goal. I'm going to talk about 4 different altered scales. One of them is actually called the altered scale, but they all involve alterations to the Mixolydian scale. I talked about the first one in the last episode, the Lydian dominant scale. In this one, the natural 4 is replaced by the sharp 4, which reflects the preferred sharp 11 extension on a dominant chord. This is the logical scale if the chord symbol is dominant 7 sharp 11, but an improviser might choose to play the sharp 4 even on a non-altered dominant chord, because the note adds so much color and it doesn't change any of the basic chord tones. Now that brings up a good point. What's the difference between a chord symbol with a sharp 11 and the same chord symbol with a flat 5, which is the same note? Well, sharp 11 implies an alteration to the 4th note, which is not a chord tone, and flat 5 implies an alteration to the 5th note, which is a chord tone, so that'll be even more of an altered sound. A good example of where you'd use the Lydian dominant scale would be the 4 dominant chord, which would be F7 in the key of C. Because the chord is occurring in the key of C, the sharp 11, or B natural, not only adds an attractive color to the chord, but it ties the chord into the key signature. We're going to derive 3 more altered scales from the Lydian dominant. One of them involves an alteration to the 9, another involves an alteration to the 5, and the last one is a combination of those two. For the first one, we're going to take the 9 out of the scale and replace it with a flat 9 and a sharp 9. From the 3rd up to the root, the scale remains the same. All scales are defined by the pattern of intervals between the notes of the scale. In this one, we see a repeating pattern of alternating half steps and whole steps. Now, you may recognize this as a diminished scale, and specifically a half-whole diminished scale. The half-whole diminished scale is commonly used for a dominant 7 flat 9 chord because it contains all the notes of that chord. It could also be played over a dominant 7 sharp 9 since that note is also in the scale, but the blues scale is another good choice for that chord. Diminished scales can look complicated when they're notated, often with both sharps and flats, but if you think of the half-whole diminished as a Lydian dominant with an altered 9, I think it makes more sense. Because the scale is symmetrical, with the pattern of intervals repeating every 3 notes, there are actually only 3 unique diminished scales. Also, because of the symmetry, patterns can be very effective on diminished scales. Here's one that's been played by a lot of jazz musicians. An augmented dominant chord contains 1, 3, sharp 5, and flat 7. From the Lydian dominant, we replace both the 5 and the 6 with the sharp 5. This produces a consistent pattern of whole step intervals, so we call this the whole tone scale. The augmented dominant chord is not used as often as the others, but again, the symmetry of the scale lends itself well to patterns. So the half-whole diminished scale contains an altered 9 and a natural 5. The whole tone scale contains a natural 9 and an altered 5. The last scale we're going to talk about is a combination of the two, and it's sometimes called a diminished whole tone scale. It's more commonly known as the altered scale, and it's comprised of the root, 3rd, flat 7th, and all 4 altered extensions. Now, there are different ways to voice an altered dominant chord, but it's kind of a kitchen sink approach. All the altered extensions are on the table. And as I said in the beginning, altered extensions increase the dominant chord's propensity to resolve. If we go back a few episodes, we saw that the third and flat seventh of a dominant chord each move by a half step to resolve. Now look what happens when we add a flat 9 and a flat 13 to the dominant voicing. Now we have 4 notes, each resolving by a half step to a C major chord. It's pretty common to hear non-altered dominants moving to altered and then to the resolution. Doing it the other way, from altered to non-altered, wouldn't sound right because then you'd be going in 2 different directions. Now, as an improviser, don't get too caught up in the difference in the altered scales. As I said earlier in this video, the important thing is where you're going. If the piano player plays an altered chord and the soloist plays the half-whole diminished scale instead of the altered scale, it's just fine. You're going to wind up in the same place.